before this.
Thank you very, very much. You too.
Thank you. Yes, sir. James, once again, we are grateful to you for gracing our committee. You really, as old Robert Hutchins in Chicago said years back on education, he said the purpose was to unsettle the minds and stimulate the youth of America. You've unsettled and stimulated at least several senators here on the committee and others that have seen the presentation you've made on C-SPAN. You had to be delayed, of course, in your flight. The hope at the time was to have you both together, and then we could really hear the back and forth and not listen to us. I had to raise some of the questions myself I'm confident you would have raised. But let's have your opening. Do you have an opening statement or a comment? All right. Let's have what opening comments you have and then the questions from the members.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me back. First, I want to make clear, I think you know, Mr. Chairman, that I was in business. I believe in free markets. I believe in free enterprise. And I believe the purpose of the economy is not just to improve indices, but to improve the state of the nation. Yours, mine. So I'm not an anti-free market man, nor an anti-free enterprise man. Quite the contrary. Felix, as you saw, is an old friend of mine. In fact, he's been my banker on and off for the past 20 years or more. But I'm in total disagreement with him. What you've heard today is the view from big business, of which I was part. And I believe the view from society in general is totally different. I believe it to be so different that I came out of retirement to start a political party in Europe, to become chairman of one of the 9 parliamentary groups in the European Parliament, to fight against what I believe to be one of the most destructive issues, proposals ever put before your assembly or any other assembly. In fact, I was watching television last night and I saw Senator Moynihan, and he said, he was there, was Representative Newt Gingrich, and the words he used were probably the most important vote of the decade. Could hardly be more important. Now, I'd like, if I may, to comment on some of the points that my friend Felix made. When talking about the loss of manufacturing jobs, all the figures you gave, he put that down largely to productivity. But in the last few months, we've seen Boeing, IBM, Advanced Microsystems, as well as joining all the other companies like Hewlett-Packard, going offshore to get cheap labor. That's nothing to do with productivity, Mr. Chairman. That's moving to get the cheap labor 40 times cheaper. And please don't think this is unskilled jobs. These are skilled jobs. These are high-tech jobs going there. Of course, there are also the unskilled jobs, but the skilled ones are going to highly skilled people, and they are moving offshore. And if you think that's productivity, then I think you would be wrong. Of course, there's an increase in productivity, and of course, that puts pressure on the job market. But why accentuate that pressure manifold at the very time when you've got the pressure? By encouraging, by creating a system that forces people to go offshore. I'd also remind you that not only are jobs being lost, but I'd confirm the figures that we all know. It was not a marginal drop in earnings that global free trade has brought in the United States. In the United States, before Nafta has its effect, and before Gatt, which is so much bigger than Nafta, has its effect, your hourly wages, according to the Labor Department statistics are 13.4% down in the last 20 years, and your weekly ones are 19.2% down. Then Felix also mentioned how competitive the states have become. Well, surely the measure of competitiveness is the balance of trade. And as you, Senator, pointed out, if you have the second worst balance of trade in history, $150 billion, that's not being competitive in world markets. Then there was a question of foreign investment. There was a question of, the words we used, attracting foreign investment in the United States. This apparent inflow of foreign investment. Well, as businessmen, and you as policymakers, obviously have to take both sides of the equation into account. There's a massive foreign outflow of investment, net. Take foreign inflow, take foreign outflow, the balance is negative. And then we heard Felix's testimony on the trillions of dollars, his words, that now move around in the global economy. He rightly said the global financial marketplace was totally integrated. In his testimony, he talks about $500 billion to be invested in China. And then what does he say? He says what America needs, and no doubt this is true about Europe as well, is an increased rate of savings. What for? To invest in China? To invest among those trillions that have to go out? Why do you need them? You need them right here. Just like we need them right where we are. We can't afford a hemorrhage. We can't increase our rates of savings just to invest them elsewhere, and where we bleed to death in terms of capital, and we bleed to death in terms of jobs. And this is the big point, Mr. Chairman. What we are witnessing is the divorce of the interests of the major corporations and the interests of society as a whole. It used to be said that what was good for General Motors, and we all believed it, probably was true, was good for the United States. That is no longer true. The transnational corporations, Mr. Chairman, I've just brought some figures, came out recently. They now have $4.8 trillion per annum in sales. They account for 1/3 of global output. The largest 100 account for 1/3 of all foreign direct investment. Now, where do you think the bulk of that investment is going? It's going where it earns the most. There's no other way it can go. What chief executive can invest otherwise, Mr. Chairman? So, if, as you've heard today, you have freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement of technology, and you can employ people for 40 or 50 times cheaper who are skilled, and you can import their products back anywhere in the world, that's the basis of global free trade. How can those investments, how can these transnational companies who have $4.8 trillion of sales invest anywhere other than where it's cheapest and where their return is greatest? Because if they don't, the system that you and your colleagues would be voting for if you pass it forces them to do it, otherwise they go bankrupt. So we have a system for the moment being proposed. You here, we in Europe. It's the same system with the same effects on us, which will result in massive unemployment, massive hemorrhaging of jobs and capital, but which will increase corporate profits. And it is believed by economists that you can measure the health of an economy by the size of corporate profits. Now, I am for corporate profits. All my business life, I've worked to increase our profitability. But I believe that when you get to a system whereby, so as to get the best corporate profits, you have to leave your own country, You have to say to your own sales force, goodbye, we can't use you anymore. You're too expensive. You've got unions, you want holidays, you want protection, so we're going offshore. And you destroy your own nation. I think that's short-term thinking. That's the real short-term investment, because that is like making a profit on the deck of a Titanic, playing cards in as clever as opposed to wise way. In Europe, we have less flexibility than you have here in the States. So rather than take a big hit, these reduction in wages, before your recent actions, before Nafta, before Gatt, these big hits on wages, we in Europe tried to protect wages, so we lost jobs. But nonetheless, let me just give you some figures. Two developed countries, UK and France. Let me remind you that in France, since we progressively moved towards this global free trade, the economy rose by 80% during the 20-year period. Fine performance. And unemployment went from 420,000 people to 5.1 million. Let me give you, if I may, Mr. Chairman, for the United Kingdom. Between 1971 and 1991, gross national product rose by 49.5%. But the number of people living in poverty has risen from 6.6 million to 13.6 million. The number of children being brought up in poverty. This is a developed country, one of the great old economies and nations. 4.1 million, 32% of children in the land officially designated as living in poverty. Now, what good, Mr. Chairman, is it to have an economy that grows well, where everybody and all the economists can say how fantastic, where the politicians can say we're going to get extra growth, where businessmen can say our profits are up, if the number of people in, and the markets are almost at all-time high, Mr. Chairman, in England, the number of people in poverty living from 6.6 to 13.6 million, and the number of children living in poverty, 1 in 3. Number of people being unemployed in France from 420,000 to 5.1 million. Now, I'm not here as a bleeding heart liberal. I'm a hard-headed realist. And it is my view that if we try and make profits and at the same time destroy our nations, no one will benefit from it, even those who make the profits. Mr. Chairman, those were the points that I wanted to respond to.
Well, you said making the policy on the deck of the Titanic. I agree with you. I was just a lot of other points with our distinguished former witness and talking about how we had to reach out, we had to do this and do that from the United States level for the developing countries out in the Pacific Rim. There's just so much the economy can stand. It sounds like almost the Vietnam policy. In other words, we got to destroy our economy to save the free world. It's the same kind of trade policy apparently that we have. The investment is going, I don't know whether you were here, but the investment is going in the most recent issue of Business Week, $69 billion offshore.
And rising.
And an increase of 40% down into Mexico itself.
Mr. Chairman, you just have to look at Felix Rotin's testimony. 500 billion is estimated in a few years for China.
You talked about the ones in England. We also have in that displaced workers been faring 4.5 million people lost permanent jobs from 1991 through 1993 in the United States. They talked about the good news, how some were reemployed, but 1/5 of the displaced workers were still looking for work. 13% had left the labor force. Further, some 47% of those back at full-time jobs were making less than before, and nearly 1/3 of this group suffered pay cuts of 20% or more. And that's not counting those who became self-employed or the 9% of former full-timers who were working part-time. Business Week, November the 14th, with a just recent issue to the effect that we were really going out of business. Let me yield to Senator Axon.
Could I just
Yes.
comment on that point
Yes,
of the
sir.
chairman, Senator?
We got the same thing going here. I mean, I have the great affection for England. I've made the comment that they were told about this service economy. Don't worry, that's what the Harvard up East thinkers were telling us. In fact, I was at Renaissance with President Clinton when Michael Porter from Harvard was there, and he was still lecturing on the comparative advantage, David Ricardo. And I just looked and said, yeah, the comparative advantage. That's why BMW is coming to South Carolina. We have never made an automobile in our history. I mean, come on. It's the wage advantage. $30 in Munich, $15 in Spartanburg. And yes, we make an outstanding automobile. So these up in Washington that retrain, I can train them to make automobiles. I'm making computers. I got digital down there. I've got 48 Japanese plants, Fuji. I'm in pharmaceuticals with Hoffman LaRoche. Don't tell me about I need more training. It's the people with training who are losing their jobs. They don't seem to understand, but let me hear your comment. I'm sorry.
The very comment I wanted to make was the question of inflation was brought up. The biggest single component of inflation, I think it's about 2/3, is wages. The reason why this time there's been a recovery in indices and GNP, despite the very substantial pressure, downward pressure on interest rates and facilitating credit through the banking system, is because salaries, earnings, have either gone down or risen very little relative to the period of the recovery. And that is the whole philosophy, is we can keep inflation down by keeping wages down. And we have forgotten the purpose of the economy, which is to enrich, to create a stable society, and to include the population, the vast number of people in active life. And instead we believe that if we can reduce salaries, we can keep inflation down. That's the wrong way round. We've just forgotten what the economy is about, what its purpose is.
That's excellent.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Sir James Goldsmith, welcome to the Commerce Committee. The last time you were here, I wanted to be here, but I had an armed services meeting at the same time that was also very important. I couldn't make it. Thanks for coming back again. I've listened with great interest to your opening statement. I do not know how much when you came in with the previous witness. I'll ask you some of the same questions, but basically I appreciate very much the fact that you've come here today. We have not always agreed. I don't know whether you remember or not, but there was a time when you were attempting to take over the Goodyear Corporation, and since Goodyear was very prominent in our economy on a parochial matter, I oppose you very much. But I've always done some study of you, and I have always admired your freewheeling spirit with regard to getting things done, creating jobs. Let me start out, if I can, with you, and I'll abbreviate the question because I asked it of the previous witness. One of the concerns that I have on this matter, and I have not made up my mind, is the part of the World Trade Organization that I am afraid gives up the sovereignty of the United States of America. I would simply say that I suspect that your country of Great Britain and the United States would not be in the United Nations had they not the big five having veto powers. It seemed to me like that the one man, one vote principle is being carried too far in this particular matter. Particularly, I'm concerned about the fact that one man, one vote, if Bangladesh, one of the 113 nations, and the United States had a trade dispute, as I understand it, if they couldn't reconcile this to the usual procedures, it goes to a three-member commission appointed by the Gatt, called the World Trade Organization, who meet in secret and take testimony in secret and make their decision. And if the decision would be against the United States of America in this instance, the only way that the United States of America could overturn that would be to go to the 113 nation total agreement and get unanimous support to override whatever the decision was made by that three-member panel, including Bangladesh, who brought the action. Is that a fair interpretation of the concerns that I state? Do you see it that way?
Senator, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the World Trade Organization is a major diminution of sovereignty. Now, the exact mechanisms, I believe, in fact, the Director General can try and settle the problem beforehand. For the same reasons as Felix Rohatyn would not wish to get into the exact mechanisms, I will not either. I've also read a lot about it. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee in the European Parliament, and I've tried to study the issues. But the one thing which is certain is, bottom line, this is giving up national sovereignty. It can't be otherwise. Otherwise, why would it exist? What is its purpose? Its only purpose is to impose discipline on all the nations to accept a trading system, and that discipline should be under the control of all the nations that participate on a one-vote, one-nation basis. Full stop. That's diminution, dilution of sovereignty. The exact technical mechanisms, legal mechanisms, I would rather avoid because they are too technical.
Thank you. Let me, if you can, explain to me why people in whom we have had a great deal of confidence over the years. I started out with President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, and now President Clinton, and all of their key advisors. I mean, that's a pretty impressive list of people who think this is a good proposition for the world, and particularly America. How do you explain what I assume you think is the wrong opinion by all those individuals that I just mentioned?
Senator, the Uruguay round, the negotiations for the Uruguay round started 8 years ago. The world has changed totally. Gatt, of course, started after the War 49, I think it was. The world has changed totally. Now, what the reasons which the chairman mentioned we haven't focused on, I think you did as well, Senator, which is the alternatives. And I think there was other conversation, are the alternatives. The alternatives are not just closing the market, becoming protectionist. The alternatives are not saying we are now going into protection and we're going to isolate ourselves from the world, each one of them. The alternative is to have regional trading blocks which have similar economies. So we're not trying to make our labor forces compete with people whose labor costs 2% of theirs and thereby destroying them, but reducing their salaries and eliminating their jobs, but having negotiated bilateral agreements between trading blocks so that each region, each nation, imports those products that it needs and not those products that destroy its jobs. Now that's what was the case 8 or 10 years ago. The regions we are talking about now, Nafta or Europe, are vast areas. We've never experienced trading blocks of these sizes, free trade regions. Nobody thought when these negotiations started that communism would collapse before the negotiations were signed, that China and Vietnam and all the Soviet nations would be part of it, and all the other countries were blocked with their socialist ideas. It's all happened. You've had a massive, total, historic shift, and you're on the same track as though it never existed, and you're being told, sign it now, because if you read the document, it's going to be too late. I mean, this is the greatest, as Moynihan, your Senator Moynihan said, the most important piece of legislation. How can there be anything more important than creating a free trade area, not with Mexico and Canada, which is already important, but creating a free trade area with China and India and Vietnam and Bangladesh and all the others, 4 billion new people? All this has suddenly happened, and the negotiations are going on as though nothing has occurred. That is why, Senator, people who were entirely reputable and wise were for global free trade before, as I was, but who have to open their eyes to reality today and say what was global free trade in those days is regional free trade today.
My last question has to do with a key statement that you made in your opening statement, and that is regard to potential massive unemployment in the United States that I think has not been looked at, Mr. Chairman, as much as we should. And I would like to ask this question in the context of a few lessons in history. You are a citizen of Great Britain. Certainly, I think that we would recognize that those of us who have done some study of history would recognize that the situation of the United States of America, once a colony of Great Britain, and Great Britain itself are extensively different because over the years, Great Britain had depended upon its vast fleet, its countries that it controlled around the world, and they were the British Empire, so to speak. That was never essentially the case with America because we were more self-sufficient, had more natural resources, obviously, than you did. But certainly, I think that we ought to at least take a look at what I think has been a demise, to a large extent, of the working class of people that once had that small island over there, a very bustling economic smokestack industries that are now essentially gone. It brings me to a question that I think will give you an opportunity to expound a little bit more on what you said with regard to massive employment. I certainly am profoundly troubled with the economists' view of low-wage and low-skilled workers as, somewhat disposable. I remember in America where hard work would earn a decent day's wage. Today, hard work and good will do not seem to go as far as they once did. It is interesting that this same Congress that passed a massive crime bill, and the next Congress will consider welfare reform. It is often said that there are a few of our local social ills that would not be solved with good jobs. Do you agree with that? What will the Gatt agreement do to those families barely getting on by both mom and dad working full-time in relatively low-skilled jobs or medium-skilled jobs that I suspect will be even a more effect on what we generally refer to as middle America? Aren't they at grave risk here?
Well, Senator, when I was young, I was taught, as we all were, that if we managed to create extraordinary material prosperity, we would solve our problems. And we were brought up in the belief that there was an inevitability of progress of wealth, progress of stability, progress of civilization. Well, during the last 50 years, so since I've been more or less an adult, we've had the greatest period of economic prosperity, economic growth in history. We have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. The economy of the United States has soared in real terms 4 or 5 times up. And throughout the Western world, in England a bit less, but still fantastic, in France just as much. And what has happened? Have we solved our problems? Are our towns more stable? Are our families more stable? Is there less crime? Less people in prisons? Are there more people in permanent and noble employment? What have we done? We have profoundly destabilized our communities. We have done everything that was wrong in social terms. We've deracinated, we've uprooted people from the countrysides. We've shoved them into towns. We haven't given jobs. We've created ghettos and underclasses. We've increased crime and drug addiction and family breakdown. All this in a period of maximum prosperity. Why? Because we were only interested in economic indices. We forgot that the purpose of the economy is not just to improve the index, it is to improve prosperity along with social stability and social contentment. And Gatt is typical of the economic instrument whose purpose is to increase corporate profits, whose purpose is to increase gross national activity, and whose result will be the destruction of the stability of our society, a continued breakdown in family life, a continued increase in crime, impoverishment, and all the other ills that we are now suffering.
Sir James Goldsmith, I thank you very, very much. Mr. Chairman, I would hope and congratulate you once again for having these hearings, because these are some of the concerns so adequately expressed by Sir James Goldsmith and others that you had before the committee that I'm not sure that American people fully understand. And I think that the American people had better have a fuller understanding than they do now, hopefully before their representatives vote on this particular Gatt agreement. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senator Dorgan.
Mr. Chairman, let me, Mr. Goldsmith, thank you for bringing a unique perspective to this debate. Your testimony before this committee on 2 occasions, I think, has been excellent and adds immeasurably to the discussion and to the debate. I would want to observe, just on this question of prosperity, to reinforce your notion of the use of indexes. The real question is, how is prosperity shared? I was thinking as you were talking about that, in Haiti, you will find some of the richest people you will find anywhere living up in the hills above Port-au-Prince. It's not that there isn't any money in Haiti. There are some very wealthy people in Haiti living up there looking down over some of the most awful, terrible slums in the world, in Cité Soleil and elsewhere. So the question is, how broadly is prosperity shared when you create advancement and economic growth? In this country, we are now facing a vote a couple of weeks from now about an economic policy that I dare say is differing some with Senator Moynihan's assessment, not the most important in a decade, but probably the most important in the last quarter century. And yet it is being met by an enormous political yawn. It isn't that there are not 100,000 people marching on Pennsylvania Avenue, or that there are not 1,000 people. There isn't one person that I'm aware of today carrying a sign up Pennsylvania Avenue saying, this is something that concerns me a great deal. This is moving in the wrong direction. This is wrong-headed trade policy. This is going to threaten our jobs. This is going to lower our income. It is being met with an enormous political yawn. I know that is not the case in some areas of Europe. Can you describe to me what is the debate going on in Europe on this? And as an observer, why do you think it is met with such a yawn in this country? And as you think about that, let me make one other point. The very areas where we ought to be able to have a stimulating debate in this country, the established press and elsewhere, I might mention, for example, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Washington Post, when we had the Nafta debate, you couldn't get an op-ed piece anti-Nafta. They ran 6-to-1 column inches, pro versus anti. Same would be true on Gatt. I haven't gone through to look at the column inches, but the fact is, the notion where you ought to have a free and open debate, you're sort of shut off, because there's two sides. There's the free traders, who are the thinkers, the deep thinkers especially, and then there are the others who oppose it, and they are the isolationist, anti-business, xenophobic stooges somehow. And so those are the two positions. It's not a very thoughtful way to frame this debate, but that's unfortunately the way it's framed. So why do we not have the kind of stimulating debate, in your judgment, that we ought to have on this? Why does it not tackle the interests of those who are politically involved?
Senator, I think you had a debate, of course, on Nafta. NAFTA's small, tiny, trivial. It was part of your regional policy, and if you like, within our European context, it's not unlike bringing in Portugal, parts of Italy, Greece, other countries which are also less developed. And it's within a context which brings in all the problems that occur between neighbors. But it was understandable. The average person could understand what a free trade area with Mexico or Canada meant. It was human in size. Gatt is worldwide. It's so big that people can't grapple with it. It is just massive. It is the biggest single economic act we could take. So that is one reason. Secondly, there's as I mentioned before, deep conflict of interest. Business wants it. Business has access to almost giveaway labor. This is the greatest change in the sharing of the value added between capital and labor that has ever occurred. Every agreement that has been reached, as the chairman said, throughout history, by strikes, lockouts, political battle, as to how to share that value added, the difference between the raw material cost and the finished product cost. Who does it go to, capital or labor? We worked it out in each of our communities in a way in which we could live. That's shattered. All of a sudden, it all goes to capital. Now, I am a capitalist. I'm talking against my financial. I'm no longer in business. But I can invest and get the full yield. But I think it's the stupidest thing I could do. Now, what happened in Europe? Nobody knew about it. Just like here. Nobody knew about it. Now, I'm in fact half English and half French. And I'm a dual national. My mother was French. And I started in France, the campaign. About 14 or 15 months ago, I started writing in the newspapers. Then I wrote a book. And then then the signature took place in December and in March in Marrakesh. And the debate went away. It was as though it was all done. So we started a political party for the European elections, so as to keep the debate going. I have no political ambitions of my own whatsoever. I just wanted to make certain the debate stayed out there. And we fought and we won. And today the majority of the French know about it and are against Gatt. Now in England, an old free trading country, I've just got around to it. I've just published my book there. Just started writing. And the debate has started, and it started very big. Enormous amount of comment. I was even very honored by being attacked in a 7-page document by the European Commission, who did a wonderful personal attack for which I thank them publicly. And the problem is getting the debate going. No one has an interest to get the debate going. Industry doesn't have an interest. The elites who work with industry, the power structures don't. So you have this split of the power structures against the people. Now that sounds demagogic, but that's the fact. And you've got to break through. That's what you're trying to do.
Well, it's very hard to do, and often those who are opposed to something called free trade, which itself is a very seductive title, are viewed as anti-business. Oh, gee, if they're opposed to free trade, that means they're just a bunch of backward folks who don't understand. They just don't get it. They're not wise enough to understand the benefits. And I wish we weren't debating these terms, because the terms themselves are so non-representative of what the subject matter is. This is not about free trade, in my judgment. I want to ask you, I must leave, unfortunately, to go downtown to talk about interest rates briefly, but I want to ask you about child labor. We had a hearing in the Congress about child labor, and some estimate there are a couple 100 million kids in the world out there working, many working under laws that provide no child labor protection and so on. And this Gatt has an article, Article 20, under general exceptions, allows a country to violate Gatt rules in order to take actions against products made by prison labor. Well, that's reasonable. We don't want socks being sold in American department stores coming from Chinese prisons. You know, we've been through that debate. But I asked the question, is there anything in here that would give us the opportunity to take action against products that are made by 12-year-olds working 12 hours a day for 20 cents an hour in working conditions that we would deplore? And the answer is no. There's nothing in this agreement that gives us the opportunity to decide that's not the kind of product we will accept. Do you view that as a serious problem as well?
Senator, I think that if you're going to have 130 countries, which I think is about the maximum one can have in the Gatt agreement, you're going to have every kind of product. and no one's going to police that. This is a pure utopia. Gatt, the global free trade, is the replacement utopia for Marxism. It's another one of these mad utopias. And as for free trade, I am entirely for free trade, within groups, within areas where competition is possible without destroying the community. I'm entirely for working with the other areas. I'm entirely for free markets. I believe we can participate in helping them develop themselves, and I know it's not the time to get into it, and at the same time have the benefits of competition, free markets, free trade in our own area. I'm not for, you get labeled protectionist. I'm not a protectionist. I'm for free trade. But I do want to protect something. I want to protect the stability of our society. I want to protect jobs. I want to protect stability of life in the towns. That sort of protection is the sort of protection we should go for. And that's how we can do it, by using the economy to serve us as opposed to us serving the economy.
It has astounded me that those of us who are concerned about protecting certain basic things in our society, a living wage and other things, are portrayed as doing a disservice somehow. There is nothing wrong with deciding that we are economic nationalists. We are interested in protecting things in our country. I don't, under any conditions, I would agree with you, I don't want to close our borders. I want our consumers to have the widest access of products available at good prices, but I also want people to understand that the things that we fought for over many decades in this country, for the benefit of all the people in this country, brings with it then, when you come to our country, certain obligations as you enter our marketplace. And that's where we fall short. Enterprises exactly believe that this is a marketplace that you move into and out of without any obligation at all. And I have obviously great disagreement with that.
If you give yourself the time before committing, blindfold effectively, to this massively important act, you can look at alternative measures, alternative economic structures which will give you free trade within regions, give you a competitive and free markets, and not destroy the stability of your community, whereby we can prosper without committing suicide.
Well, unfortunately, the fast-track procedure brings this to the Congress and says, no amendments whatsoever. You debate it, you vote, and that's it. And that of course, is a travesty of the democratic process as well. But again, I incidentally have finished reading your book, which I think is called Trapped, and I found it to be a wonderful discussion of this, and I suppose I found it interesting reading largely because I agreed with most of it. But I think it is a contribution to this debate and would commend it to others as well. Mr. Chairman, I unfortunately have to depart, but thank you very much for inviting Mr. Goldsmith.
Thank you very, very much, Senator. Let me also, Sir James, thank you for the Trap. I've read it. Very, very interesting. Well, I'll bring up that point. You described in there you talked a minute ago about Gatt, and to me it highlights the mindset of knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And you described the GDP figures, the gross domestic product figures, and how we really increased, enlarged, embellished those figures with disasters and everything else. Will you put that in your testimony? Can you respond to that? I think that's very interesting because it's a fact. And I think that we're not just talking feelings, we're talking the actual facts.
The point I make in there, Mr. Chairman, is that GNP or GDP is a measure of activity, economic activity. It's not a measure of good activity or bad activity. It's a measure of activity. So, as we all know, if you have a hurricane or an earthquake, GNP goes up because you've got to repair the damage. If you have an epidemic, GNP goes up as you put up more hospitals and employ more hospital staff. If you look at the three great tragedies of the day, cancer, drug abuse, and crime, according to the best estimates I could find, they contribute 7.4% to the U.S. GNP. So I would merely warn, that's all I try and do in the book, that GNP is a useful measure of economic activity, but it is not a measure which is qualitative, and you can have growth in GNP while at the same time destroying your community.
The answer, I can tell you now, so you'll sort of understand that it is a mantra. It's just an absolute belief. If you're going to be a United States senator and you're supposed to be a leader, I can tell you they won't pay any attention to you if you don't say immediately you for free trade. I know from the experience, you run for president, the Trilateral Commission will immediately have you up to pledge on the altar of free trade, the Foreign Affairs Association, and all the corporate leadership that you've got to have their support and everything else like that to prevail. That's all they know, because that's all they, as we understand, profit. And I think the big misunderstanding then coming down to just us regular folks, you know, we equated immediately free trade with the free domestic market. We all believe in the free domestic market. Let competition ensue. But there's no such thing as a free international market, whatever. And it's a hard thing to get them to understand. One question that you could comment on, because you know Europe, and you get the previous witness that chicken lick in the sky would fall if Gatt were rejected. The inference being, of course, that if we ever enforced, and incidentally I don't mind being called a protectionist, I'll never forget when President Reagan was sworn in on his second term, we had inclement weather, we were in the rotunda. He raised his hand to preserve, protect, and defend. And that afternoon we went down and had a little debate, and somebody got all mad because we've got the FBI to protect you from crime, Social Security to protect you from ravages of old age. You go right on down, health care, Medicare, Medicaid to protect you, the whole fundamental antitrust laws to protect you from monopolies, whatever it is. You can go right on down. That's the fundamental of government. But if we want to protect our economy like they do in Europe, now, about 15 years ago, we had a textile bill in, and I realized at that particular time that Europe and the United States both had a deficit in the balance of textile trade of $4 billion. Today, Europe is less than $1 billion. Today, the United States has grown to $31 billion deficit in the balance. They enforce their laws. That's what I mean. You know, they say, well, oh, God, what does that mean to them? That means just that. If they enforce their laws and deal as businessmen will on top of the table, trade is trade. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have the rancor, say, in Europe with the Japanese. They go along with your trade practices and rules. You go along with theirs. Everybody understands it's a mature relationship. It's none of this moral question of cheating or crybaby, be fair, level the playing field, be fair. They just have a different philosophy in trade. How is it in Europe you really maintain your protection? You enforce your laws and don't have the rancor that we have. We got to constantly go ahead and meet with the Japanese, and we'll both bow and scrape to each other and pledge that we're going to have a better understanding later next time. Nothing on financial services, nothing on workers' rights, nothing on the environment. You can go right on down the list. They rejected the president over in Naples. He's in Jakarta now, but they rejected him in Naples in June when he put out financial services there. They said, let's go in the next room and talk. I mean, have a drink. No use to talk about this one. So how is it in Europe you don't have the rancor, which seemingly we have to suffer here in this country?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't think we have enough. Because the European Commission, and the European Commission is the equivalent of, it shouldn't be, by the way, but it is. It acts like a government. It has the monopoly of initiative. And it's dominated by religious free traders. They consider it a religion. There's no doubt that Germany believes in free trade, and the bulk of the establishment in Europe, economic, political, and other, believes in free trade. So what I am saying, what I've said to you today, would be largely repulsive to the economic, political powers in Europe, but largely, I mean, massively acceptable to the public, who are the ones who are suffering from it. So that, at the moment, that's not happening. Japan, on the other hand, is the living example that you can export. without having free trade. I mean, we heard Felix Rohatyn say, what's going to happen? How can we benefit from this great new world which is opening? I agree with that. We've got to benefit from it. But we don't have to destroy ourselves to benefit from it. Japan hasn't. We can have a trading policy which suits each region. Trading should be on that basis, and which helps, because we can invest there. And we can have, you see, what big business doesn't make the sufficient difference in public about is a difference between investing in a country so as to conquer part of the market of the marketplace in that country. That's one proposition. And the other is investing in the country so as to re-import the goods cheaply into your home market. That's a quite different thing. Now, if somebody wants to go and invest in China, and that's fine by me, so as to conquer the Chinese market, which is what you were being told about, so as to go out there and become a big player in the in the telecommunications business and the electrical, whatever market you like, and you build your factory there, and you go there and conquer part of that market. Good for you. That's good. But if you're going to put a factory over there just to re-import the goods here because you've got cheaper labor, that's death. The first is life, the second is death. And this is the big difference. When you hear all this business about conquering markets, that's fine if you don't re-import the products back. If it's not just to get cheap labor. But insofar as Europe is concerned, Europe has lost an infinite amount of factories to low-cost areas. And I know that if I had anything to do with it, we would have a regional free trade market. We would come to a bilateral agreement with you in the North American market. We would do deals which were suitable for both your market and ours, which did not destroy our jobs, which allowed your industries to come into Europe and sell their goods by manufacturing in Europe, and allowed our industry to come into the United States and build factories and employ people and invest in the United States. And we would participate in each other's communities. We would try and compete actively, vigorously, and try and take bigger market shares in each of our communities, but we'd be employing, we wouldn't be destroying.
Exactly. I was referred just to Texas, but not only that, automobiles, I'll never forget, we were to have a hearing on that before this committee. I looked, and it took 4 months if we delivered a Ford automobile on the dock in Tokyo to be inspected. You see, they delivered 1,000 Toyotas in Portland, Oregon. We'll inspect 10 in an hour's time in Portland. That'll be a fleet inspection. They put them on flatbeds and come and sell them in South Carolina and Washington. But it takes about 4 months. But then I learned that that's nothing, man. It takes you a year to buy a 1994 Toyota in Le Havre in France. I mean, they deliver them on the dock there, and it takes them a year to inspect. And that's what I was getting at. They seem to know how to handle and at least hold the line some on these markets. If we had a similar kind of confrontation, call it that as you will, but trade is trade, business is business, I think they'd better understand it, and we wouldn't have this $31 billion deficit in automobiles alone to Japan.
The right way is to get the right structure. Right. And the right structure has to be done by those who are the leaders, and then everything will follow. We don't want the wrong structure which we get around. Like the example you gave in Le Havre, the right way is to try and make it clear that the policy we're following now is wrong and destroying our society, and then play by the new rules, which will be rules which will be beneficial for us, as opposed to avoiding rules which are just thoroughly destructive and which people have to try and avoid.
Very good, Senator Exon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I will not detain you but just a moment, Sir James Goldsmith, for one last question to follow up on what is a major concern of mine that I expressed to you, and you gave very pointed answers to in your previous testimony. Since that exchange, I have had a call from a very high administration official, a very good friend of mine, who tried to allay my fears on this matter of sovereignty. Everyone now seems to agree with the concerns that I have with the World Trade Organization and the citation that I made to Bangladesh and the United States. I brought this up with Professor Lawrence Tribe, and he said, well, Senator, it's even worse than one man, one vote. Then he went into the explanation of how if the three-member commission appointed by the World Trade Organization decided against the United States and with Bangladesh, he said it pointed out that it would take 113 members, including Bangladesh's agreement, to override that, which is another way of saying nothing will ever be overridden. The other side of that is, as explained to me, that while that might be true, from a practical standpoint, that would never happen. And I say, why would that never happen with Bangladesh or some other smaller nation? I cite the example, would we be in the United Nations if we didn't have veto as a superpower? They said no, because Bangladesh could never ever afford to give up their opportunity to sell in the United States, and therefore they would not press such a case. I suspect that there are some good things about the Gatt agreement that I like, but I would like to have your impression, since we have had a whole series of situations where the smaller nations have got together and under the one-man, one-vote principle would have overridden the interests of the United States and Great Britain and some of the other real powers were they not facing the veto. Explain, if you can further, whether or not you think my fears in this regard are correct, and whether or not, and how would you answer the explanation that is given? Well, technically you probably are right, but that simply would never happen, because Bangladesh, in the example that I cite, would never dare to give up their rights to invade and take advantage of the tremendous marketplace in America.
Let me try and answer it, Senator, by not in a legal way, but common sense way. What can the World Trade Organization mean if it's based on one vote, one nation? What can it mean other than one vote, one nation? Does it mean no one's committed or everybody's committed? And in this particular case, everybody is committed. Now, once you've got it and you can't get out of it, if you're going to rely on the fact that nobody is going to force you to do it, that's a pretty flimsy and bad agreement. If you don't want it to happen, write it in. Have an agreement which makes it explicit. Why do they want to use code languages if that's what they're saying? They're saying no one's going to dare do it. Why not put it in the agreement? I mean, as of the moment, the agreement is that we all dilute our sovereignty massively. We lose it on the basis of a voting group of between 108 and 130 people. I don't know exactly how many nations are going to sign up at the end. And that is a fact. Once you've signed it, you're in it. Now, if you're going to rely on the fact that nobody is going to use it, then why are you signing the document in the first place? Make it explicit. This is everything at the moment. At the moment, there's a sort of panic going on. All of a sudden, everything that's in the World Trade Agreement doesn't mean this, it means something else. 8 months ago, a year ago, Gatt, the World Bank, and the OECD produced a document saying that the financial benefits of Gatt, when fully implemented, would be $213 billion per year for the whole world. Sounded good. I read it, and I found that was in 10 years. I then found it was perhaps. And I then found that was equal to 0.7% of the prospective world GNP at that time. And the three of them did it. Then they confirmed it a few months ago. And now they see that there's just a bit of a battle against them. Every day they panic. It becomes 500 billion overnight. They went from 213 billion to 500 billion. And now it's 120 billion for the US alone in 6 months. Don't believe any of that stuff.
Let me refine this just a little bit further so I understand it for the edification of myself and other members of the committee and hopefully the Senate as a whole. Going back to that situation that I have alluded to as for example, Bangladesh and the United States, supposing the United States said that's very unfair, the World Trade Organization has been very unfair to us, We can't get this overturned, obviously, with 113 nations, unanimous vote, including Bangladesh, who brought the action in the first place. Would the United States, in that kind of a scenario, be faced with saying, okay, we are going to withdraw from our obligations under Gatt as far as Bangladesh is concerned, and we're not going to trade with them, and we're not going to accept any of their goods? Could we do that and still maintain our relations in Gatt with, let's say, the nations of Europe, including Great Britain?
I would prefer Professor Tribe to answer it. I've seen his opinion, and it is clear to me that you cannot get out of it. And once we're in, we're in. And therefore, I would suggest that it not be hurried, that the idea that it has to be done by a certain date, when it's 8 years it's been going on, why not study and see what's in there? Every day you find surprises in that bill. All sorts of things you didn't expect to find, you're finding. Not my concern, those are American concerns. But I'd read them. Find out, how can anybody sign this bill without understanding fully whether you can get out of it? Without understanding fully how much sovereignty you're giving up? Without understanding fully what's in the bill? Whether it concerns only trade issues or wholly extraneous issues? How can anybody, any responsible person, and I now count myself not as a responsible person, but as a politician. I'm going to have to vote on this on the 14th. I can tell you how I'm going to vote. And my point that I'll be making in the European Parliament is not 5% of the members of that Parliament know what's in the bill, and they're going to sign it. Now, how can we sign something which is the most important piece of economic legislation in our lifetimes, and even those in favor of it say, like, as I mentioned before, Senator Moynihan, how important it is? How can we sign it and act responsibly without knowing the answer to all the questions you're asking? And not 5% do.
From your understanding, and you've obviously studied this a great deal, from your understanding, could the United States, and would the United States, under Gatt as presently written, be able to withdraw from any relations with Bangladesh, in my example, and still maintain their place in Gatt with all the other 112 signatories?
In my view, no. And unless there's been an infringement of some kind by Bangladesh, in my view, no. And the question will be, can you get out? Because that's going to happen. Because countries are going to want to get out. They're going to have so many social problems when unemployment grows to the level that will be intolerable to society, where the fundamental conditions which sustain democracy will be in jeopardy. They'll have to get out. And then we're going to see a whole new ball game. How is it going to work? I don't know. That hasn't been discussed. It's for life.
Thank you, Mr. Goldsmith. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Sir James, Lowry Wallach, our lawyer from Public Citizen, could answer it accurately. But practically, you can't get out in that you don't want to get out. We have a dickens of a time here changing the mindset. After all, we think we're leading when we're losing. We think it's from productivity is the reason we lose these jobs, or from technology when we know it's the technology abroad, the productivity abroad due to cheap labor. And being a leader, you would be burdened then sort of morally to go along, at least for a few years, don't just next year or the following year, 5 to 10 years, try to support this wonderful World Trade Organization, because the United Kingdom, part of France and the United States would be a minority of 2.5 out of the 117 to 123, and within a 5 to 10 year period, we'd gone down the tubes economically. I mean, so yes, there are technical ways. Yes, you try to get a vote to get out when the mindset is totally different. It's a tragedy, Sir James, that we're having to do this when we're out of session. In the context, I could guarantee you if we were in regular session, they'd be leaving all of those other committees, and we'd have more senators than we have in the audience. But they're all back home after the election and otherwise. I hope the record being made here can be studied, because you have really done us a tremendous favor, made a magnificent contribution to the discussion, debate, and the awareness of the real dilemma we have. Yes, it is a deficit problem. Yes, you can see all of these other domestic problems with respect to homelessness, crime, and everything else. But the number one issue on top of the table here in America should be a competitive trade policy, because we've got to hold on to what we've got left. That third leg I've described of the economy has got to be rebuilt. We're not rebuilding it in this country. You have certainly been a tremendous value to helping us to rebuild it. I can't thank you enough. The committee will be discharged on November the 22nd, and this will be our final hearing. I thank everybody for their attendance. Thank you very, very much, Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you for returning the last.
Yeah, that's right.